Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video of History Valley podcast. Today I'm joined by Egyptologist Professor Manfred Bietak, and today he's going to be giving us a lecture on the Exodus. So welcome back to the show, Manfred.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to introduce you today to recent investigations, how to put the tradition about the Exodus into archaeological and geographical research according to the most recent attempts to it. Well, what is it? I cannot, or maybe like this, yeah. Well, first of all, I'm leading you to Thebes, Western Thebes in Egypt, the ancient capital of the New Kingdom. On the western bank of Egypt, of Thebes, a very important discovery was made in the 20s, 30s of last century by the University of Chicago. They excavated the temple of Aya and Horemheb, and also the temple of Ramses III in Medinet Habu. But in north of the temple of Medinet Habu, of Ramses III, is the temple of Aya and Horemheb. And within this temple of Aya and Horemheb, there was excavated a shelter for workmen, which dates to the early 20th dynasty. Here is a plan of the temple of Aya and Horemheb, which was constructed in the second half of the 14th century BCE. And in the time of the 20th century, of the 20th dynasty, which is the early 12th century BCE, workmen who had the task to break down the temple of Aya and Horemheb and to build a new temple for Ramses IV, just to the north of this temple precinct. And the excavators found a shelter with a plan of a house, of a so-called forum house. It's a very clear plan of the so-called forum house, which is considered by Israeli archaeologists as a prototypical house of the early Israelites in the early Iron Age until the Babylonian exile, which started at 587. Anyway, it is a very clear-cut plan. The house was built of wattle and daub, probably a very original kind of construction. And the earliest forum houses were found at Tel Batash in what is today Israel, at the foot of the Judean mountains, at Tel el-Umayri, which is just south of Amman, and at Wadi al-Lahun. These earliest forum houses, they date to the transition of the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age 1, so around 1200 BCE. This is the forum house of Tel Batash. You see, it has 4 rooms, a broad room here at the entrance. Normally it is and at the opposite side of the entrance, and 3 aisles, so to say. Probably this was a kind of courtyard, or maybe it was covered. Nobody knows that. And here is the entrance, a sheltered entrance. So this is a reconstruction of this forum house from Tel Batash, excavated by Amihai Mazar. And here we are in Tel el-Umayri, in the Madaba plain. Also very similar plan with a broad room and a 3-aisled major part of the house, and here an entrance shelter. But, and this is another reconstruction. So normally they consist of a kind of broad room and a three-aisled major part of the house. In this case, it is reconstructed as a courtyard. But in the Iron Age 1, we have numerous four-room houses. They are very prototypical for the early Iron Age population. But we have to be clear, these are not necessarily all Proto-Israelites. They could be other Iron Age people, but closely related to the Proto-Israelites. All what we can say is that the forum house, at least in the early stage, was used by a population of closely related people of the early Iron Age. This is an excavation site excavated by Aharon Kempinski. This Tel Mazos. You see several variations of this Iron Age forum house. Very typical is that only one aisle has columns or pillars, and the other one has a firm wall, but also pillared on both sides. This is also possible. Anyway, one has to ask, from where did the workmen in the temple of Aya and Horemheb came from? It is a puzzle. It is really a puzzle. We know that Ramses III, who was the father of Ramses IV, who gave the order to tear down the temple of Aya and Horemheb to get building material for his new temple, but his father, Ramses III, according to Papyrus Harris I, made raids in the southern Levant, in the desert of Zaire, for instance, which is practically bordering Edom, but also other places in the southern Levant. And he brought home numerous prisoners of war, which, according to the custom, may assume were distributed among the main temples and as slaves, so to say, as temple slaves. And we may imagine that one of the groups of these displaced Shosu Bedouins, they were placed at the disposal of the new temple project of Ramses IV. This is the most likely scenario. The origin may be here, the Zaire, Edom, and there were prisoners of war brought from Edom and from the other places in the southern Levant by Ramses III to Egypt. Well, this is one scenario where we can perhaps pin down early Israelites. But it's, of course, not 100% sure. At least it is from a population which were akin to the early Israelites. They may have been Amalekites, or anyway, there was a whole series of tribes at that time. Among them, one were the early Israelites. Well, now we come to another scenario, because the history of temple slaves working in Thebes is not a part of the biblical tradition, but it is a phenomenon which we have to take into consideration, because this forum house can be dated exactly to the same period where these forum houses appear in the southern Levant, particularly in what is today Israel and also Jordan. Let us go now to the north, to the eastern delta, which is connected via the Wadi Tumilat with the northern Sinai. We have here two sites which are very important and which will accompany us in my further talk. One is Ramses or Pyramesse, the capital of the Ramessides, of Ramses II in particular, and his followers, and Pithom in the Wadi Tomilat. Well, this is a satellite picture of the Wadi Tomilat, which connects the eastern delta with the Sinai. Today, it is a fertile part full of agriculture, but this was not so in antiquity. This is a map of the French expedition under Napoleon Bonaparte, 1799, and it is quite an accurate map already by the engineers of the French expedition. You can see here an ancient canal, an artificial canal, which connects the eastern delta with the Gulf of Suez. This canal was started by Pharaoh Necho around 600 BCE, and it was finished by Darius, who was able, via this canal, to ferry to Persia, to Iran, the tributes of Egypt, because at that time Egypt was a part of the Persian Empire. But the Wadi Tomilat was not barren originally. Its western part, in antiquity, in the second millennium BC, was an enormous overflow lake, which we were able to reconstruct by the isohypsis, it's an overflow lake which was 18 kilometers long and 1.8 kilometers wide. An enormous lake. And beside this lake was Tel Erotaba, which we identify with Pithom. And I will explain you immediately why we identify it with Pithom. Now, what is very interesting is that we have a series of toponyms from the Wadi Tomilat, which are of Semitic origin. Already the region was called by the ancient Egyptians Cheku, but Cheku is at the same time identified as Sukkot, which means temporary shelters, and it's a toponym known in the Bible. Not everybody supports this identification, especially not Ellen Gardiner, a very eminent Egyptologist, but most other researchers do so. And it seems to be a very old toponym, which may go back to the Hyksos period. Therefore, it was written in the transcription, which was used in the Hyksos period or in the Middle Kingdom even. But there are several others, such as Brechot, lakes, plural, which is known not only from the papyrus Anastasia 6, about which we will deal in a minute, but also there are other toponyms like Seger, which means fortress, Seger, or Gezem or the Gezem, which is the famous Israeli Egyptologist Sarah Groll identifies with Goshen, with the land of Goshen. And there can be hardly any doubt that the land of Goshen was the Wadi Tomilat, not because of this, but because also of other considerations. There are other Semitic toponyms, but not in the Wadi Tomilat, but along the northeastern border of Egypt. Migdol, the tower, the fortress. If Zaru was a Semitic toponym, this is disputed, but at least Migdol is one of it. It's a typical name of an Egyptian fortress, but it is a Semitic name. Anyway, to come back to Sukkot or Jeku, temporary shelter, you have still used by Bedouins in the borderland today, these temporary shelters, which we may imagine this was a Sukkot. This is a photograph of Jim of a colleague of mine who worked also in ancient Near Eastern connections in connection with the Exodus. Anyway, we go now to the Wadi Tumilat. We come back to the Wadi Tumilat and to a famous papyrus, Papyrus Anastasis 6, which dates to the late 19th dynasty, to the reign of Seti II. It's a letter, a model letter written by scribe apprentices, and it's obviously a copy of a kind of protocol written by Egyptian frontier police to the Vezirate, mentioning that a troop of Shosu Bedouins from Edom, not Edomites who come much later, but Shosu Bedouins of Edom, were given the permission to enter this place and to proceed until the pools of Pitom, or the lakes of Pitom, in order to keep alive their stocks, their livestock, their animals. So the Egyptians were humane in this time, from time to time at least, but we may imagine that this happens again and again and again, and that these Bedouins were not going back, or some of the Bedouins did not go back but stayed in the Wadi Tumilat, especially at this end of the 13th century BCE. A climatic trauma came about. A drought was developing, so especially Bedouins living with their stocks at the edge of the desert were the first who had to move to survive. And so they did and arrived in Egypt, but they came from Edom. This is this overflow lake, and this enormous overflow lake was at that time perhaps consisting of several lakes, and these were called the lakes of Pitom, and Pitom must have been Tel el-Rotaba and not Tel el-Mashuta, which you may read in many other Egyptological publications, because Tel el-Mashuta was not inhabited in the Ramesside period, but only from the late 26th dynasty, which means from around 600 BC onwards. Well, Ramses II constructed here a fortress, and in the fortress was also a temple. And this fortress and this Tel el-Rotaba is now a subject of excavations by a Polish-Slovak excavation team under the direction of Sławomir Rzepka. Anyway, there is a Ramesside temple, and this temple was dedicated to the god Atum. Atum was a sun god from Heliopolis, but this was a temple of Atum, because this is a block from the pylon, from the entrance of the temple, which identifies the temple and the dedication of this temple. So we see here the god Atum, who hands a scimitar to Ramses II, who is slaying a Shosu Bedouin. So this was the main problem of this region, the migration from the east through the Wadi Tumilat to Egypt. Anyway, Atum, the temple of Atum is called Pitom. From this comes the name Pitom, or Per Atum, the house of Atum. So no doubt Tel el-Rotaba was Pitom, one of the store cities mentioned in the book of Exodus. And This is the photograph of the excavator, first excavator Flinders Petrie, with the representation of Ramses II slaying, which is a magical picture because all what you see in relief in ancient Egypt, it means for the Egyptians virtual reality. So this is a magical picture which should block away immigrants. Well, these people come in the right time from the right area. Edom. Edom is a region just south of the Dead Sea, and according to the book Deuteronomium 33:2 and Judges 5:4-5 and Habakkuk 3:2-3, this is a region from where the Lord went forth. So they came from a very hot area for us. Maybe early, adherence to a cult of the tetragram. These are the Edomite mountains, the Red Mountains. Edom means red. And yes, the Edomite mountains, a very austere region where it is thought that the Yahweh cult came from. Now we have from a temple of Amenhotep III from in Nubia, in Soleb, a series of inscription of enemies of Egypt, which were conquered. One of them is the land of the Shosu Bedouins of Ishwa, which is considered by many Egyptologists and Old Testament scholars as the earliest mentioning of the tetragram. But also in the same inscriptions, Shosu Bedouins from Zaire are mentioned, and from other regions which are nearby in the southern Levant. Well, we jump now. This is a very important assessment because these Edomites, which were considered till now only as a kind of illustration how one could imagine this sojourn to Egypt by the Proto-Israelites. But in this case, if we change the chronology from the time of Ramses II later to the time of Ramses to Seti II, or at least later into the time of the 19th dynasty, in this case, we have, there could be theoretically early Israelites, or at least a population closely related to the early Israelites. Now we go to another monument, which is a famous stela of Manfred Bietak, which is in the Cairo Museum, which informs us about the campaign of this king, who he was the successor of Ramses II and reigned late in the 13th century BC, so shortly before the first forum houses appeared, maybe already the one in Tel Batash and Tel Umeri. But this stela mentions a campaign of Manfred Bietak to southern Canaan. Canaan is mentioned first, which is surely ancient Gaza, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yenoam. This is the succession of sites mentioned in this stela. And Yenoam lies near the Tiberias Lake. And it's very interesting that it's the first mentioning of Israel. Therefore, it's called the Israel stela. And they are classified not as a toponym like the others, towns, which I mentioned, but as people. This is the classifier of people, man, woman, and plural. So therefore, it was thought that at that time, Israel has not yet settled firmly, and may even have been beyond the Jordan. This is a very important piece of evidence. Anyway, no doubt this is Pitom, one of the two sites mentioned in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, and Ramses must have been the residence of the Rebbe site, Pyramesse, which is identified since 20-30 years at Gantir. Well, this is an enormous site of about 600 hectares, an enormous site. And the first king who started to reanimate the former site of the Hyksos Avaris was Horemheb, who built an enormous fortress and rebuilt the temple of Set, who was, however, the temple of the Syrian storm god, who became later the ancestor god of the 19th dynasty of the Ramessides. But the center of Pyramesse was in the north at Gantir, which was an island. Here is a reconstruction of the topography of Gantir by my colleague Joseph Dorner. Here was the palace, here was the major temple of Amun-Re Harachti and Atum, of the most important gods of Pyramesse, but there were also other important sites, and it was subject of excavations by the Pelizaeus Museum Hildesheim, who worked in tandem with us. We worked in Avaris and the southern part of Pyramesse. They worked in the north, and it was an enormous town. Here is a defense wall of Horemheb cutting into a palace of Thutmose III. These are tiles from the fortress of Horemheb at the end of the 18th dynasty. These are the remains of the temple of Set, of Sutech, but in reality of the Syrian storm god. You see here pits of trees. There was a whole tree grove around the temple, and the size of the temple was enormous. The enclosure wall was more than 10 meters thick, and here are the pylons. Unfortunately, we could not excavate the temple itself because now all these excavations have been stopped by the Egyptian antiquities authorities. And here is, after 40 years of excavations, we found here a lintel of a sanctuary of the god Sutech, Set, the Egyptian storm god. But this is, and the cartouches of Horemheb after the Amana period, when the temple was destroyed by Akhenaton. The temple was rebuilt by Horemheb, and later by Seti I. Here you see the enclosure wall. Here you see pits of a vineyard within the temple. Anyway, it was an enormous temple precinct at the south of Pyramesse, and in the Papyrus Anastasis 3 and 2, the temple of Sutech is mentioned in the south of Pyramesse, and here we are. It is in the south of Pyramesse, and there were other temples which were in the east, in the north. Here is a temple excavated by the Egyptian antiquities authorities. But the temple of Sutech is the most interesting one because it goes back already to 400 years before, to the time of the 14th dynasty, even before the Hyksos period. Well, this is a stela of 400 years. You see Ramses II offering to the god Set, but this is not the Egyptian god Set. This is the god Baal Zephon, the Syrian storm god. You can recognize him by the Asiatic crown with a long pomon. He has a Syrian kilt with tassels, and the only part of the Egyptian dress is a long dress covering all this, like also the Egyptian king. But this is the Syrian storm god Baal Zephon, whose cult was introduced by the king Nehesi already around 1700 BCE. He is presented here as the father of the fathers. This means the 19th dynasty created an ancestry, a divine ancestry from this Syrian storm god and the Egyptian god Set. This is, so to say, a kind of interpretatio Egyptiaca, but you see, it is the Syrian storm god, who is the ancestor of the 19th dynasty, which was, of course, not of royal origin. Ramses I, the grandfather of Ramses II, was a general, and he was a close colleague of Horemheb, who made him his successor. But what is interesting, behind Ramses II is a vizier with the name Seti. And we know that the father of Ramses II was, or the grandfather of Ramses II had the name Seti. So, and the father of Ramses II was Seti. The great-grandfather was also called Seti. So the one belonging to the god Set. This shows that probably this dynasty originates from the Eastern Delta, and they may even have Hyksos ancestry among them. Anyway, it's a very interesting stela, and commemorating a cult which goes back 400 years to the time pre-Hyksos. So this is most important for the 400 years, because in the Bible it is stated that the children of Israel stayed for 400 or 430 years in Egypt, what was surely not the case, because they were only 4 generations, or even less than 4 generations, maximum 3 generations in Egypt, what would be 50, 60 years maximum. The absolute dates in the Bible, how shall I say, they are corrupted. Anyway, this cult goes back to King Nehesi. Nehesi was a king of Asiatic origin in the time of the 14th dynasty, around 1700 BCE. And on this obelisk, which was found in Tanis, that originates, of course, from Awaris, he is shown as a Levantine king with his high crown. And and here again is a cylinder seal showing the Syrian storm god Baal Zephon stepping from the Mount Chazi, which is Jebel Akra in Syria, to the Mount Chazi Nani, which is the Amanus Mountains in northernmost Syria. So this seal was produced in Egypt, according to Edith Porada from the Columbia University, who was one of the best analysts of cryptic art. Anyway, he's shown as as the overlord of the sea. The snake Yam is a god, and he is a patron of the sailors. So very important that this cult was introduced in a harbor town like Awaris, and also Pyramesse was a harbor town. But this was long before Pyramesse was built. This was a time of the 14th dynasty, which controlled the harbor of Awaris. Well, And this King Nehesi constructed monumental temples of Near Eastern type, a broad-room temple with a deep niche, in front of it an altar with burnt offerings. Here is another Near Eastern temple, a bent axis temple, consisting of 3 elements and a tower. And the best parallels of these temples are in northernmost Syria, in Ebla, in Jebel Brak, Tel el Brak, and this shows, and also in Aleppo, the broad-room temple of the god of Aleppo, and much later than our temple in Hatzor is very similar, the temple at area H. So this shows from where the early settlers, the early Semitic settlers in Awarisk may have come from, not from the southern Levant, but from the northern Levant, at least the elite of these new settlers in the time of the 13th and 14th dynasty. And the Hyksos is another story, but I can not go into details now. Well, Pyramesse itself, the residence of the Ramessides, which was excavated by the Penzius Museum Hildesheim, has a very rich, it's very rich in monuments. Here it has had channels cutting through this town in order to provide traffic, but to excavate a town of 600 hectares, it's not possible, not even in 1,000 years. Therefore, a geomagnetic survey was done, and which revealed numerous antiquities of very great importance, especially this palace here, which is at present excavated by the Penzius Museum Hildesheim. It's living quarters. Here a kiosk which was excavated, the royal kiosk, which was perhaps for receiving delegations by the king. Anyway, Gantir is an enormous residence, and it is quite clear that the town of Ramses should be identified with Pyramesse and not with other towns with the name of Ramses. Here you have a stable for 500 horses from the time of the 20th dynasty, excavated by the Penzius Museum Hildesheim. Here you have the tackling stones where the horses were shackled, and even horse toilets. So it was a very grand town with military. Here you have fragments from chariots, a whole workshop for producing weaponry was found and excavated. So Pyramesse was a very important town, one of the biggest in the Near East, with channels cutting through living quarters. And here my colleague Dorner identified the palace, and here he identified the main temple, Amon-Re Harachti Atom. Well, this is the second of the major towns mentioned in the book of Exodus. So we have Pithom and Ramses. Only Donald Redford objected because P. Ramses means the house of Ramses, and in the Bible it's only called Ramses, and therefore he suggested it is a different, it could be any foundation of Ramses II. It must not be the residence, but the texts make it very clear that it was the residence, and the great Ellen Gardiner, the great Egyptologist, made it clear that the per Ramses, the per can be omitted, and provided that In front of it is mentioned Pardemi, which means the town of Ramses, or Naitahut after the name. So what leaves us alone with the name Ramses? And we have also another town where the P was omitted nearby. It is Pi Soptu, the house of the god Soptu, which the name survived until today in Saft el-Hene. Saft comes from Soptu. So it's another example where the P was omitted and not important anymore. No doubt, Pi-Ramesse was the town Ramses. Well, in the late 20th dynasty, the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, the easternmost branch of the Nile, which was called Pamu and Pare, which means the waters of Re, was silted up in its estuary, and the water was lost to the Tanitic branch, and therefore all this was not anymore habitable, because a water branch provided not only irrigation but also the major means of transport. So the residence was shifted to Tanis, and Pi-Ramesse was not mentioned from the 21st dynasty onwards until the late until the time of the 30th dynasty, because monuments mentioning Pi-Ramesse and the priests of Pi-Ramesse were transported to Tanis, but were not of great importance. And suddenly, in the time of the 30th dynasty and early Ptolemaic period, they thought here was Pi-Ramesse in Tanis. And also in Bubastis, they found these stones mentioning Pi-Ramesse. So there were two opinions in this time, in the 4th century BCE. In Tanis, they thought this was Pi-Ramesse. And in Bubastis, they thought at least nearby was Pi-Ramesse, maybe at Pisoptu. Because the stonework of Pi-Ramesse was shipped to Tanis and to Bubastis in the time of the 21st and 22nd dynasties, which means around 1000 BCE. And were reused to build the new temples of the Libyan dynasties. Well, in the time of the 4th century BCE, Jewish exiles tried to reconstruct traditions of their ancestry in the Eastern Delta, and they had to follow the Egyptian opinions, and therefore you will find in the different versions of the Bible, especially the Septuaginta, a southern Exodus route, and in other parts a northern Exodus route, particularly even a northern Exodus route in the Targum Yerushalmi. How come? Well, the stones from Pi-Ramesse were shipped to Tanis, they were shipped to Bubastis, and probably also to Pelusium. And in the 30th dynasty, when Egypt itself was still in the threat of being occupied by the Persians again, there was a kind of nationalism coming up, and they revived ancient cults. The cult of Ramses of Pi-Ramesse was revived. There was a priest of Ramses of Pi-Ramesse in Tanis. There was a priest of Pi-Ramesse, of Ramses in Bubastis. And this shows us that they had no idea where originally the Ramses town was situated. And thus, you see here the obelisks originally, which they stood in Pi-Ramesse, but now they were shipped to Tanis. And embellished the new temples in Tanis. And the same happened in Bubastis. And what remained behind were just the basis of colossal statues of Ramses II in Gantir. And the toes and the pedestal broke away and stayed behind, but the others were brought safe and sound to Tanis and to Bubastis and probably to Pelusium. Anyway, so the northern and southern theory of the Exodus were developed. In Tanis, they thought that the sea, the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, where the Israelites passed through, was the Mansala Lake. And the Septuaginta thought that they broke up through and crossed the Timsach Lake, was the Sea of Reeds. And in another version in the Septuaginta, they thought that the Sea of Reeds was the Red Sea, and that Pitom was situated at Heliopolis, because also Heliopolis had a temple of Atum. Anyway, it is possible that there were several exoduses and not one exodus. And I'm going to speak about the scenarios now. The first scenario may have happened during the time of Setnacht, the founder of the 20th dynasty. He was a general, and the end of the 19th dynasty ended in a chaos and of several years of chaos, and several groups of throne pretendents battled against each other. The victor was King Setnacht, the father of Ramses III. And he mentions that he drove away his adversaries, and among them were also who had bribed Near Easterners with gold. And this was one scenario, because leaving the strongly guarded eastern border of Egypt for a bigger group of people was not possible under normal circumstances, and only in periods of chaos. And then the first chaos was in the times shortly before Setnacht took control of Egypt. The second possibility, the second scenario, was in the time of Ramses III, the son of Setnacht. He, in his reign, happened horrible things. Not only the eastern Libyans, the Libyans wanted to, the western Libyans wanted to penetrate Egypt, and he had to battle against them, but also from the west. From the east came the sea people. And this is the scenario where I showed you. What happened were that the sea people conquered the coastal strip of the Egyptian province of Canaan. Egypt lost them forever. And the Philistines and other sea people settled here. The Checker at Dor, the Philistines in the later Pentapolis. So the most important towns were Gaza, Ashkelon, and Gath and Ashdod. These were the 5 towns of the Philistines, and the Egyptians were only able to continue with their control of Canaan in 2 separate areas, one in the southern part of Canaan in the south, and one in the Jezreel plain and the Jordan Valley, but only for a short time, until after Ramses IV, maximum Ramses VI, they were able to maintain some control, and then they had to give this territory up. The battles against the sea people under Ramses III, he was able to check the sea people, to guard them or ward them off from Egypt, but they destroyed frontier fortresses. They tried to invade Egypt by land and by sea. We have here the famous representation of Ramses III shooting arrows on the sea people who came into the Nile mouth, into the easternmost Nile mouth with their ships. And he was also able, there was also a representation of a land battle. So he had won 2 enormous battles against the sea people, and he took many hostage. And in the following period, he constructed an enormous fortress in Pithom, with big walls, 20 meters wide. I mean, you can imagine. But this was not the only fortress in the isthmus of Suez. Another fortress was found just north of Suez, a smaller fortress. But other fortresses may have been destroyed by the construction of the Suez Canal. And who were the workmen in these fortresses? This was a thinly settled area. And the only workmen he could recruit were the settled Bedouins in the Wadi Tumilat and also in this isthmus of Suez. And if you try today to enforce labor among Bedouins, I think they would say goodbye and it would go away. And I think this is a second scenario of a possible exodus, and probably several such scenarios happened indeed. And well, these are the excavations of the Slovak-Polish excavations. This is the enormous fortification wall of Ramses III. And this is the entrance gate, an enormous entrance gate with big towers. So he was expecting formidable adversaries. And therefore, I reconstruct the second route of Exodus through the Wadi Tumilat. And interestingly, the Bible tries to combine both. They mention that they broke up they started the Exodus from Ramses, which without doubt was Pyramese, and went to Pithom. But Pithom, was far away, and in between were the big swamps and overflow lakes of the Bahr el-Baqa system, a drainage system along the eastern edge of the delta. Most likely, the northern group went they had to go in between the Pelusiac branch of the Nile and the Bahr el-Baqa drainage system until they reached the isthmus of Gantara. And if they would continue here, they would have to pass numerous fortresses. And so they returned, and this is written in the text of the Bible. They returned and passed through the Sea of Reeds. The Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf, is an ancient Egyptian name, Pa-Chufi, which is mentioned in several Egyptian texts of the 19th and 20th dynasties. And it is also mentioned in one text in the Papyrus Anastasi 4, together with the She-Hor, which is another toponym mentioned in the Bible. So Yam Suf and She-Hor both are mentioned in the Bible. I think the Sea of Reeds were the Balach Lakes, which were once bigger than they were today, because at that time they were fed by an active Nile branch. It was surely covered with reeds, but Bedouins surely knew paths along this through this lake, and were able to pass this eastern lake. And the other one was the Timsach Lake, where they had a similar possibility to pass the eastern frontier. I have seen myself in the Mansala Lake paths of frontier migrants cutting through reeds which were 5 meters high or even higher. And maybe these passages through these reeds coined the idea of the sea which was cut, which was put aside, and there were mountains of water at both sides, but it were perhaps the passages through the reeds. Thank you. Well, I was talking about the possibility of a southern exodus route starting from Pitom through the Wadi Tumilat, crossing the Timsah Lake. And in the Sinai, there was a possibility of moving southwards. And you have a series of wells along this route. You cannot go to the north from here. So anyway, the geographical evidence would foster the theory of at least 2 exodus routes. And but for instance, Abraham Malamat from the Hebrew University, he was even in favor of many exoduses which may have happened in the course of the New Kingdom. I just want to mention that, but I think there's 2 scenarios are: number 1, Pharaoh Seth-Nacht at the beginning of the 12th century, the northern exodus route from Pyramesse northeastwards, and finally crossing the Balach Lakes as Yam Suf or Pa Chufi, which is always mentioned together with Yam, with a she-whore. Therefore, I prefer this exodus route and the position of Yam Suf at the Balach Lakes. And the other one is to start from Pitom in the time of Ramses III, when he was fortifying the eastern frontier of Egypt and recruiting local sedentary Bedouins who moved away. This is another explanation. Thank you.
When do you date the 2 exoduses, and how far apart were they from one another?
Very soon afterwards. I mean, the first I would date to the time of Seth-Nacht, which is at the beginning of the 20th dynasty, early in the 12th century BCE, and the other one at the time of the late, at least after the 8th year of Ramses III, which is also in the first half of the 12th century BCE, when he started to fortify. After the incursion of the Sea People at the eastern frontier, and he started afterwards to fortify the eastern frontier of Egypt and needed workmen. And this frontier region, he could only rely, if he didn't want to import many people from Middle Egypt or from Southern Egypt, he relied mainly on the sedentary nomads in the Wadi Tumilat and in the eastmost of Suez. And this is a very likely scenario. And another consideration is that you cannot leave Egypt with a bigger number of people during the maintenance of a strict frontier control, which happened during the whole 18th dynasty and the 19th dynasty, except in the aftermath of the 19th dynasty, when you had troublesome years. if the frontier fortresses were strictly manned, you cannot leave so easily Egypt, except one or two people, but not, let us say, the Exodus comprised some 100 people. I think not more. But these 100 people, I mean, not thousands of people as related in the Bible. Not all the proto-Israelites were in Egypt. It was only a certain number. And from this certain number which were in Egypt, only a part of them were able to leave. And I don't think that there were more than several hundreds, but several hundred people could also not leave under strictly controlled borders. They can only leave in times of a chaos. And chaos was at the end, after the end of the 19th dynasty, before Setnacht could keep up control again, or in the aftermath of the invasion of the Sea People. Another consideration is in the book of Exodus, and also in the following book of settlement, there is no mentioning of Egyptians in Canaan, and this is odd. And this only can happen after the Egyptians had left Canaan, which happened during the 20th dynasty. And well, this leaves some time between leaving Egypt and the settlement of Canaan. But it's odd that the early Israelites settling in Canaan don't meet Egyptians. Egyptians are not mentioned at all. And this can only have happened, could only have happened in a time when Canaan was abandoned by the Egyptians. And also, proto-Israelites entered Canaan also from other parts, maybe Transjordan, maybe some of them were already in the country, but they were not a part of the core group. The core group, who was small, but who gained probably political importance and was able to transmit their experiences with Egypt. Later, the core group came from Egypt, but there were some hundred, not more.
Do you think that there could have been somebody that led one of those exoduses that you were talking about that is similar to our Moses figure in the book of Exodus that they based the character on?
Yeah, I mean, this is surely, it needs a leading figure, no doubt. If it was one leading figure or several leading figures is another question. But also in the tradition, there's not Moses alone, there is Aaron, later Joshua. So there were leading figures, and it is, personally, I believe that this experience, this tradition, was carried by a relatively small core group. And the other proto-Israelites immigrated from other regions in the Near East. And one should pay attention that the genesis of Israel has not yet ended at that time. The ethnogenesis was still in progress, and other groups, related tribes, joined them.
What do you make of later traditions coming from the late first millennium BCE, beginning of the first millennium CE, that make claims that and we talked about some of this before, and
we talked
like
about
the Josephus and the Hyksos and Manifu, like when they talk about that the Hyksos are the Jews. What do you think
Yes.
caused them to say that?
Well, the Pentateuch is, of course, has many layers, many layers in time, and there was a constant redaction, editing process of the tradition. And the first hundreds of years, 200 of years perhaps, this was just a verbal tradition, and later it was also a written tradition. It's very clear that, for instance, in some parts of the Bible, for instance, in the Psalm 78, the kingdom of Tanis, the 21st, 22nd dynasty and aftermath, were in the mind of the editors. And this is very clear. The Zoan was considered as Pyramese, or as Ramses, the town of Ramses, and the fields of Zoan, which are also mentioned in this tradition, are definitely the Mansala lakes were in the mind of the editors, and later other traditions merged. For instance, the very late tradition, it didn't stop. The editing process didn't stop even with the Septuagint. They thought of Heliopolis even to be the town of Piton, because Heliopolis had the same name. The temple of Heliopolis, Piton, was per Atum, the house of Atum. And therefore another Exodus version was coined at that time. And even later, the Targum tradition developed different considerations of how the Exodus happened. I mean, they even thought that the Pelusium entered into the considerations, and Tanis and Pelusium both entered into the consideration. So it was a constant process of editing, in which serious scholars were involved, and therefore many colleagues, especially the group in Copenhagen, came to the conclusion that everything is a very late invention or tradition, and they didn't believe in an Exodus in the time of the Ramessides, because there was also a mix in dealing with Pyramese or with Ramses, with the town of Ramses, and even the Assyrians came into play. And this is definitely a tradition which was developed in the time of the Assyrian conquest of Judah and Israel and its aftermath.
Do we know anything about their what these proto-Israelites believed? Do we have artifacts of idols or religious artifacts from them?
Well, the early Israelites were not all adherents of the cult of the god from Edom, but they had different. They were also adherents of Canaanite cults. If you see how the prophets are, criticizing the Israelites, still building up Masebot and Asherahs and things like that, and we find in towns, in excavations, idols of Asherah and of Canaanite goddesses. So these cults were still alive, even in the Iron Age, and not everybody was a staunch supporter of the only God.
So would it be fair to say that they had a mix of Canaanite deities and Egyptian deities in their religion?
Well, one shouldn't forget that the early political entities of Israel also encompassed Canaanite population, which of course, they were not all Israelites, not all inhabitants of early Israel were Israelites, they were Canaanites. And also part of the population were Philistines, which were partly perhaps under the control of the Israelites. So in the united time of the United Monarchy, at least this is a conclusion of the Bible. Anyway, one shouldn't think of a homogeneous population. Israel, ancient Israel, the greater Israel encompassed other people also.
So basically, Israel constituted different cultures that were kind of merging together. And when they traversed down to Israel in the two exoduses, it would culminate into the Israel that we see in the ancient Israel in the first millennium BC.
Yeah, the early Israelites had to absorb also other inhabitants of Canaan, such as other Semitic speaking populations, but also, I mean, Phoenicians came from the north. There were still the Canaanites in the country, enormous quantities of Canaanites. And last but not least, there were also immigrants from Cyprus, from the sea, coming from the sea. So it was a multi-ethnic, they were multi-ethnic population, and therefore it was difficult also to control the monolithic religion, which not even the kings followed. The prophets had constantly to criticize the kings of having wives who were still following Canaanite cults and so on. But I'm not an ancient Testament scholar. You may find somebody who knows much better about it. I'm an Egyptologist who ventured to, from Egyptological side, to throw light from what we know from Egypt and from the geography of the border region of Egypt, to throw light on the story of the Exodus.
And before we close, what would you recommend to viewers that want to research this themselves, the common layman that wants to go find more information about what you're talking about? Could you point them to that direction?
Well, there are some semi-popular books, but they are serious. One of them, just one moment. Is this book. I don't know if you see it. It's Ancient Israel, revised and expanded, edited still by Herschel Shanks and his colleagues. The last edition, I also participated together with Gary Rendsburg. And I mean, the most reasonable authors for studies of the Bible are Gary Rendsburg, but also in Germany, Axel Knauf, for instance, but also the former books. Many detailed studies were done by Ottmar Kehl. I mean, the German-speaking community has many very serious scholars, but surely also in the United States you have top scholars on this subject. especially in archaeology. But I mean, I may recommend the fourth edition of Ancient Israel, from Abraham to Roman destruction. This is, I think, a good beginning.
Well, okay. Unless you have anything else to add, Manfred, I think it's safe to say I can stop the recording here. And I want to say thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah, really enjoyed the lecture. Thank you for the answers to my questions, and see you later.
Bye-bye.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.